this week we're going to talk about how exactly we establish our new government as a new country coming in 1776. We don't start off with the Constitution that we've got today, which is actually the longest living Constitution on earth. But what we do start off in with something called the Articles of Confederation, which I'll explain here in just a moment. Okay, so first of all, we create something known as, like I said, the Articles of Confederation. And to really contextualize, why is it that we created something like this and not, the Constitution from the very get-go, is really to understand where we were at as a country in 1776. We know we needed a new government, okay? We wanted a government that was going to somehow allow us to, elect particular, people, and we would vote for elected leaders, much like the Parliament was in Great Britain at the time. We also knew we needed something that protected individual citizens from the national government. We were very weary as a country because of what happened during the American Revolution. What we didn't want was another King George. Okay, so basically in 1776, officially, at least in our mind, the federal government, or the new government, America was a new country, and we had 13 separate colonies that needed to come together as one country. And so we call these states, but each state, by itself really almost ran like its own little government, and it had from the very beginning. And so each state already had its own constitution, its own legislature, and even 8 of the states already had their own Bill of Rights. But the United States, like I mentioned, needed to have its own government to be able to form treaties and alliances and to do something when we needed to come together as a country. So that's where we were. We knew we wanted to have our own state autonomy, but we also knew that we needed some sort of central government to help us come together. So we call this very first government something known as the Articles of Confederation, and it lasts for 12 years. But really, almost from the beginning, we can start to see it unravel. Maybe not so much that, but in 1783, when the Treaty of Paris is signed and the revolution is over, we start to see this plan that we have begin to unravel. Okay, so why is that? Okay, but let's back up for just a minute. Why would they even have this type of government? And you can almost figure this out by thinking about the name of the government itself. It was called Confederation. A confederation, if you look it up in the dictionary, literally means a loose brotherhood. It means like a loose friendship. And so that's exactly how they envisioned each other at the time. Well, I got your back and you got my back, but they didn't really necessarily want to come together as one country and lose the autonomy they had built for hundreds of years, or 150 years about, right? And so just like I stated, they were like this loose confederation. And the way the Articles of Confederation were established, let me move my little picture so you can see here, that each state could send between 2 to 7 representatives at the time to pass any law. 9 out of the 13 states had to agree. And also, they did have a national Congress that would settle disputes and things like that. But all other powers were left up to the state. So the state essentially had a majority of the power at the time. Very little power laid in the federal government. Okay? They didn't want to create, and let me move this again here. They didn't want to create, they didn't have another tyranny. They didn't want another King George. They actually don't even have an executive branch at all. So we don't have an executive until, 1789, until George Washington becomes president, really 1791. Okay, so, and not only that, but we couldn't tax our own citizens. Okay, so in order to get money for the federal government, they had to have donations, okay, by the state governments. And as you can imagine, that didn't really happen very often. Okay, so again, just to review, why was it set up this way? Writers of the Articles of Confederation, remember, taxation without representation. They're very upset about this. So the federal government could not tax. The only way people were taxed was through their state governments. They were worried about the large central government, so the states don't have to follow federal laws. Okay, so today, federal government laws always trump state laws, but that wasn't the case in the first Constitution. All right, they were worried about, having to follow the British legislature, so really the states, again, had their own power. The king himself had quite a bit of power, and so they had no executive branch or court system. They would just operate very much singularly by themselves. And if they did want to make an amendment, a change, which amendment means change, to amend to the Constitution, all 13 states had to unanimously agree, which, as you can imagine, never happened. They don't agree, and no amendments ever happened to it. So in 1787, a group of representatives come to the Constitutional Convention. And this is actually a picture in Philadelphia. If you go there at Constitution Hall, it takes place in Philadelphia in the summer, and it's top secret. This convention itself was done very top secret. They close all the windows. They don't let anybody in. They don't want anybody to know that they're planning to get rid of the Articles of Confederation because they're concerned that people will think the government's in disarray. Okay, many of the representatives who came there weren't exactly privy to the fact that they were getting rid of it. They just thought they were coming there because the articles weren't working. But many started to suspect that that is what was going to happen. They were going to scrap the Articles of Confederation. And so people, individual people like Patrick Henry, who said, "I smell a rat," in Rhode Island as a state, they don't send representatives because they're upset by this. But 55 delegates attend the Constitutional Convention from the other 12 states. So who are these leaders? So the leaders of the convention, the person that was leading it to begin with was George Washington, well respected, was the hero of the Revolution as the general of the Continental Army. He is asked to preside over the convention. James Madison, who will later be termed the father of the Constitution, is the only one taking notes. The press is not allowed in the secret meeting. And so the only notes that historians have to this day are what James Madison takes note of. Okay, and we today call the men that created this document the Founding Fathers. And all the participants, though, notably, and I know this comes up, more recently, were all white, all male, all wealthy property owners. Okay, so it wasn't exactly representative of the majority of Americans at the time. Okay, so what kind of issues did they have? So the biggest issues, so 3 issues they were really going to be central to solving. Number 1, how much power is too much power in the federal government? That's something they're going to argue about. How should they do representation in the legislative branch? Okay, they knew they were going to have a legislative branch. They already had one with the Articles of Confederation. But who's going to have more power, the small states or the large states? Okay, the way the articles were set up is that every state had 1 vote no matter the size. Is that going to hold water forever? The other contentious issue is slavery. The northern states at the time were already starting to abolish slavery. Okay, that this idea of freedom that they got from the British made them start to think in the north that slavery might not be the right thing to do. But people in the South, it was their entire way of life. It was their whole economy. So they were not willing to get rid of the institution of slavery, and they were going to be pretty firm in it. Okay, but let's first talk about the amount of representatives and how they decided that. So there were kind of 2 schools of thought. One was the Virginia plan, which satisfies like the large states, and the other is the New Jersey plan. So let's look at the Virginia plan first. Essentially, what it said was that it was going to create 2 bicameral houses for the legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And they also believed that the legislature should be decided on by the number of people in your state, so by population. So the large states, population-wise, are loving this because that would mean that they would get to send more people to Congress, and they would have more say-so in federal government issues. Okay. The small states obviously didn't like that. They come up with the New Jersey plan, which would be 1 unicameral, meaning 1 house. They wanted more than 1 executive person, not just the hands of an executive in 1 person. And they wanted small states to be able to have an equal voice as large states. So they only wanted 1 vote. Okay, but the small states and the large states were not going to agree on this. So in steps a man named Roger Sherman, and he comes up with this plan known as the Great Compromise, or also the Connecticut Compromise. Connecticut, because that's the state he was from. What it said was we will have a bicameral legislature, 2 houses, one house, the House of Representatives, that will be based on population by state, and the other is the Senate, which will have 2 representatives for every state, no matter the size. That is still what we have today. Okay, we elect the people for the House of Representatives, but the difference is in the Senate. Initially, the senators were decided by the state legislatures. So we would elect people to a state legislature and they would pick our senators. Today, through the 17th Amendment, we pick our senators directly, okay? And we elect them directly. And we also elect our state legislatures and the House of Representatives, but there's much more power in the hands of everyday people today with that. Today, our state representatives, or I'm sorry, our state senators at U.S. Congress are Cornyn and Cruz, for example. Okay, so the big issue, contentious issue, is slavery. So the southern states did not want to get rid of slavery. The northern states, see it as a contentious, dirty issue. We start to see this divide between the 2 sections of the country. And like I mentioned previously, the northerners, after the revolution, are going to begin to see and start to gradually get rid of slavery in the north. And so they would like to see it gone. But they also know that there is no possible way that they're going to agree as a country if they don't have some kind of compromise when it comes to slavery. Okay, so the southern states, they want to have the slaves counted representatively so that they can have more power in Congress. Obviously, the northern states don't want that, but they come up with this compromise called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And what the Three-Fifths Compromise essentially said was that for every 5 slaves in the South, 3 of them could be counted for population purposes. Also, 3/5 of them would be counted for taxation purposes. So that satisfies the North that the South is going to pay more in taxes. But it does kind of benefit, obviously, the people in the South because they end up having more power in Congress until the end of the Civil War, or really beginning of the Civil War. Okay? And so this is going to become an issue. And the other issue was slave trade. Should we still keep engaging in the slave trade? And they do agree, the South does agree to end the transatlantic slave trade, no engagement in that in 1808 in 20 years. But the reality was that they didn't really need that because the main way that they were getting more labor on their plantations was through the reproduction of black slave women. So it was through like almost intentional breeding. And so they didn't really need that anyway, but they do end the slave trade in 1808. That was part of their compromise regarding slavery. The last disagreement was over how they should elect the president. Now, they didn't, first of all, they didn't know if it was going to be life term. Actually, Alexander Hamilton really wanted it to be a life term. He idolized George Washington. Everybody pretty much knew it was going to be George Washington because of his massive popularity. But he loses in that. People decide, no, we should only have him for 4 years. Remember, they're still afraid of having a tyranny. But they also decide that the real reality of the Electoral College and how that came about was that the Founding Fathers don't really trust common people to make decisions. So they have people called electors place the votes for them. Okay? The reality is that the Electoral College turns into a winner-takes-all approach, which is why the election in 2016 and the election in 2000, Trump's election against Hillary Clinton and George Bush winning over Al Gore, both of those presidents won without a majority of the popular vote, but they won the electoral vote because it's a winner-take-all. Okay, for example, in Texas, if we have, let's say, 35 electoral votes, if 60% of the people vote for Trump and 40% vote for Hillary Clinton, Trump would take all 35 of those electoral votes. It's winner take all. Okay? It's a system that is highly contentious. It's a system under debate, and it is going to be a source of your discussion question. So be sure to watch the video I have that is very good on explaining the Electoral College Do you agree with it? Yes or no? And make sure you defend it. Remember to respect your classmates, because that's a very political, contentious issue. Okay, but now that they've made the Constitution, now they have to ratify it. So they make the Constitution, but the states, 9 out of 13 states, have to ratify or agree to the Constitution. So they go off into their states to go sell the Constitution. But there's 2 groups that emerge from this Constitution. Not half of them, but a group that once the Constitution passed, they become known as the Federalists, and the group that does not want the Constitution to be passed, known as the Anti-Federalists, okay? And so the Federalists were people that were for ratification. They believed that a strong national government was needed. They thought that they needed to tax, they needed to protect the federal government, or the country itself, and they also believed that the way the Constitution was created is a good balance of power with a 3, the judicial, legislative, and executive branch all kind of balancing each other out. And so they went out to sell this, okay? The other group are the Anti-Federalists. Now, these are people that thought there's too much power in the federal government, states' power is going to lose too much autonomy, and on top of it, one of their biggest issues was the fact that individual rights aren't protected, and they want a Bill of Rights, and it's not in there yet, okay? Another kind of interesting note is they also thought that the slavery compromises were a little dirty, and they weren't pleased about this, and they predict that it's going to lead to civil war, which of course it does. Okay, so who are our Federalists? So James Madison, who's the father of the Constitution, Washington, Hamilton, John Jay. Now, Hamilton, John Jay, and Madison are going to write something known as the Federalist Papers to convince everybody. The Anti-Federalists were led by, Sam Adams, Sons of Liberty, Patrick Henry, Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death, and George Mason. And George Mason in particular was very vocal about the fact that a Bill of Rights was not there to protect individual people, and he's going to probably be one of the leading voices in the Anti-Federalists. All right, so like I stated before, John Jay, James Madison, and Hamilton write a series of, get this, 85 essays of why the Constitution should be passed. They were extremely well organized, and it's still considered as some of the best writings on government in world history today, the Federalist Papers. Matter of fact, you can go down to Barnes & Noble's and buy it. It's still there. It's written as well. But they use this to argue why the Constitution should pass and should be ratified, and they end up, winning the argument. The Anti-Federalists, not quite as organized as the Federalists were. By the way, they didn't want to be called Anti-Federalists. That was just a name that was given to them because they were against the Federalists, per se. But the ratification does occur. Constitution is ratified. The states, after a couple years, do formally ratify it. We get to our 9 states that we need to ratify it by the end of 1788, but all 4 of them, the remaining 4, do ratify because they want to be part of this new American government. Madison, as a way to compromise with the Anti-Federalists, agrees to add in the Bill of Rights, which will be added and ratified 4 years later. So the Bill of Rights is added in 1791. Okay, so now we have our new structure of government. In our next week's module, we'll talk about how this early republic, this new government, does. Okay, so I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will talk to you soon.